well, sorry, it's the markets. It's this equilibrium approach. So these are three pillars, and I'd like to briefly look at those. And once we've done that, we'll see that they are propaganda. This entire approach is propaganda. Modern English language equilibrium economics is propaganda developed for a particular purpose. And development economics is just a particular outgrowth of it. Countries have developed, a small number of countries have developed using very different policies. Hopefully we have a little bit of time to talk about those. And then we probably won't have time to talk about what comes next, so I might as well say it now. The end game by those who have power and want to maintain their power, because it is about power, is to introduce digital controls everywhere to maximize their power, introduce a whole new dimension of controlling society through central bank digital currencies, digital ID, and restrictions of usage of the media, and so on. And they tell you that growth is bad for the environment, when actually that's not true. Economic growth is just a measure of prosperity. It means we won't allow you to become prosperous, is what they're saying when they say, growth is bad, you shouldn't have growth. So, let me start with the track record. What is the track record of modern economics? They're beginning to admit it, that there's a terrible track record. Paul Romer, respected macroeconomist, professor at Chicago and other places, chief economist of the World Bank, he said that macroeconomics has made no progress in at least 3 decades. It's moved backwards. It's gone backwards, literally. There's 2 other professors in California, published in a top journal. It's not disputed. Namely, there hasn't been any progress in economics for a whole century. We still don't know how money works, how fiscal policy works, how growth is determined. What determines growth in the short term and the long term? They admit it. And yet they give the advice to how countries should behave and what policies they should take, when actually their discipline has failed. But you see, it's not an accidental failure. So what about this IMF and the World Bank for the last 80 years, telling countries how to develop, giving good advice, we believed, giving them money, giving them incentives to take the right policies. And many countries have followed this. So how many countries have actually succeeded moving decisively from developing country status to developed country status during those 80 years? Well, there is not a single one. They have no case. No country has developed on the basis of the IMF, World Bank, Washington Consensus, modern English language equilibrium economics advice. It's been a failure. Instead, developing countries are burdened with debt. They are taking the wrong policies that make them, in relative terms, poorer compared to those that are zooming ahead. And here's why. So we've identified these 3 pillars of this fake economics, which is what it is. The first one is the theory of comparative advantage. Let's look at that, because it sounds so logical and has convinced generations of researchers and students and policymakers. If you've got a lot of land, use the land. If you've got a lot of people, use the people. If it's easy for you to grow apples, you focus on apples and export the apples. That's what it says. Now, who says this? This was actually proposed by somebody called David Ricardo in the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century. Who was he? Well, he was one of the richest people on the planet. It's a fact. He's said to be the 2nd richest person in Britain. And the richest was not the king. So then you know where to look for the richest if you're interested. He made his money working with him in the city of London in the financial markets. So he retired at the age of 42, being what today would call one of the biggest billionaires around. Trillionaires, perhaps, would be the contemporary equivalent. He retired, built himself a little country house, today the spectacular home of the Princess Royal and her family. That's his house he built himself. He was the richest, one of the richest people, number 2, of the richest country and greatest imperial power in the world, having half the world as colony. Well, what else did he do? He invented modern economics. This is not in dispute. If you check with historians of economic thought, the technique that modern economics uses was invented by David Ricardo. He literally invented modern economics. How? What did he do? Well, critics call it the Ricardian vice. What is that? The excessive use of abstract model building based on many unrealistic assumptions, and to quote a historian of economic thought, the use of false and misleading assumptions to prove the results one desires. That's the technique. It's called deductive economics, the deductive methodology. There's 2 methodologies to do science anywhere, deductive and inductive. The natural science, where we've had lots of progress in chemistry and physics and biology and so on, they use the inductive method. But David Ricardo argued in economics we have to use the deductive method. And surprise, surprise, we have not had any progress because it's unscientific. It's not the scientific method. How could he be so influential? He literally paid cash to people to adopt his approach. He bankrolled James Mill and his son, John Stuart Mill. He maintained good relations with other economists of his day, like Malthus, with whom he agreed, there's too many useless eaters on the planet. Malthus worked for the East India Company. Do you need to say any more? So, this is the modern economics that we know. And here are some of the assumptions and axioms, all made up stuff. People are selfish, rational, maximize their utility, then you assume perfect information, complete markets, and the whole lot. Then you get equilibrium. This is your foundation of equilibrium economics. Markets are efficient and perfect. And here's his theory of comparative advantage of international trade. There's his list of assumptions. We don't need to go through them. A lot of assumptions are made. And then he shows comparing 2 countries, 2 goods, trading Portugal and England, trading wine and cloth. He shows that, look, if each country specializes in what they're better at in relative terms, comparative, relative advantage, that's enough for both countries to benefit. Due to scale economy, specialization, the total output will be larger, and they swap and they share. Now, this is not controversial. He's saying trade is beneficial. Nobody ever said the opposite. He was criticizing the mercantilists of being stupid, not understanding economics. Why are they called mercantilists? Because they said mercantile activity, merchant, trade activity can be very beneficial. So this is part of the propaganda. He wasn't actually saying anything new, but he did it with mathematics, so he looked more scientific. And his conclusion was, so you focus on whatever happens to be at that moment your relative advantage, and it's a very static approach. So you're fixed. And if you are a country that has a lot of commodities, like most developing countries, you focus on exporting commodities. But it's been proven that the terms of trade of commodities exporters decline over time. And that means you must stay poor and get poorer over time, and your current account will move into deficit. You've got then pressure to borrow money from abroad, and that is encouraged because the second pillar of this fake economics says, this is disproven, because actually it's static, built on all these assumptions, and is nothing new. The mercantilists were smarter. They knew it's the benefits from trade that are important. And how do we get those? Ricardo says nothing about this. How they distribute it. That depends on the terms of trade. And if your commodities exporter, your terms of trade deteriorate, that means you get few of those benefits until you have no benefits from trade. That's actually what, when you look at even his models, that's what they show. But it's presented in such a propagandistic way, students are never told the real implication of this. So you need to move away from your static position where you're stuck doing low value-added stuff. You need to move up the high value-added ladder. How can we prevent the world, the British thinkers were thinking, how can we prevent them from developing? We need to give them a theory, a belief that it's good to just export low value-added commodities. They will work hard and sell us their stuff cheaper. They get poorer, we get richer. That's what happened. What about the second pillar? Developing countries need savings to grow. They need to borrow money from abroad. Otherwise, you can't grow. Well, I have to be very brief because I have to wrap up. My time is up. This is on the assumption that the money supply is fixed, which is not true. And you should not borrow from abroad. Who creates money? It's the banks. When they give a loan, they create money out of nothing. Bank credit creation. Consider the conspiracy theory for a century until I did the first empirical test. Look it up. Can banks individually create money out of nothing? It's published in a leading finance journal. Empirical proof banks create money out of nothing when they give a loan. So, and there's a second paper called Lost Century in Economics. Also, they're both open access, so you get them for free just by Googling these names. It's my papers. Banks are special. They create the purchasing power that's given to the borrower to lay claim on resources. That's where developing countries should get their purchasing power from, to invest, make sure that small firms, businesses that create jobs in productive activities, implementing new ideas, new technologies, moving up the value-added ladder, get the money. And countries that have been successful have done this. There are some. There's much more here, but I have to jump. Equilibrium is nonsense. I won't spend much time on this. You can easily prove this. There is no equilibrium. There's never been any market ever in equilibrium. It's just, it's a fiction. There's never been evidence of equilibrium. So it's a fairy tale that is more demanding than the fairy tale in Alice in Wonderland. You have to believe impossible things, we learn from Alice in Wonderland. But not as impossible as equilibrium, we also learn. So, who supplies the money supply? It's the banks. So what about the countries that have been successful? They know the following. This is the one key insight, since I'm out of time, how the economy really works. For growth, you need money. Money is created by banks. Central banks only create 3-4% of the money supply. And it's important who the banks lend the money to, for what purpose. There's three scenarios. If banks create credit for asset purchases, as central planners have been doing in the West for the last 3-4 decades, because they don't want economic growth. They don't want any more prosperity. They want to give us asset inflation, asset bubbles, and banking crises. If banks create credit for consumption, you get consumer price inflation. That's what they did in March 2020. Fed program, implementing my quantitative easing proposal, which originally I proposed quantitative easing in 1995 in Japan. But for a deflationary economy, they did this QE2, I call it, in 2020 in America and Europe, when there was no deflation, the economy was growing strongly. So of course that had to create inflation. That's the top right box. The green box is what we need. Bank credit creation for productive business investment. If you make sure this is happening, you get growth without inflation. There's no limit to growth. There are no limits to growth. Why? And why is growth not bad for the environment? Shouldn't we have degrowth? No. Ask a physicist. The laws of thermodynamics tell us there is no growth. Growth doesn't even exist. When we talk about growth, we mean economic growth, which is a statistical fiction. A statistical fiction cannot hurt the environment. So we can have high growth, 10%, 15%. And of course, the countries that did this used central bank guidance of bank credit for productive business investment to do this. China, Japan, double-digit growth, 10, 15% growth for decades. China did this. How did they do this? Deng Xiaoping came to power, and everyone agreed, look, we're still too poor. We just need prosperity. This ideology, fictional, made-up stuff, what we're suffering from in the West still, let's forget that. He said in his first speech, let's forget ideology. Let's seek truth from facts. He adopted the inductive scientific methodology. What are the facts? Well, let's travel to Japan. He traveled to Japan in the same year he came to power with 300 of his top experts. You delivered 15% growth for 2 decades. How did you do it? Please tell me. I've come here as a student, he said very humbly. Tell me the secret of high growth. And they told him. They asked him, so how many banks do you have? Oh, 1 bank for 1 billion people, are you sure? How about you create 5,000 banks with 35 branches each, and each branch employs 30 loan officers that lend to small firms. Then in total, you've got more than 5 million people making decisions about money creation and allocation to give it to the productive business proposals. They will look at hundreds of millions of applications in 1 year, and then you get high economic growth. That's the green box I showed you. And that's what they did. The rest is history. 40 years of double-digit growth. That's what we need to demand from our politicians and leaders, because that's the truth. But you're not supposed to know it. You're supposed to think, oh yeah, well, tighten my belt, austerity, rationing, restrictions, degrowth, zero growth, because they want to control us. And of course, they're working hard on doing these controls. We've seen in Japan, that's my QE proposal, by the way, in 1995. That's me proposing quantitative easing to get out of the recession, because we don't need a recession. When you see a recession, a banking crisis, then you know it's unnecessary. By the way, being in Istanbul, I should mention the geopolitics, of course, matters, because the First World War broke out after Britain decided that the Berlin-Baghdad-Basra railway that the Germans and the Ottoman Empire were building is going to be a threat for the entire navy, and therefore the hegemon's control over world trade and the world economy. That's the key factor why they wanted to make war on Germany. I will end with this because that's, of course, the events we see today. Venezuela, Iran, what America is doing there, and Israel, is about this threat to American hegemony that they see China is posing. China is the new Germany. And of course, the Belt and Road Initiative is the new Berlin-Baghdad, Berlin-Istanbul-Baghdad-Basra railway that China has been building. And so now we see the choke points being choked, and the bombing in Iran was actually quite directly on Chinese Belt and Road infrastructure, so you know where we are. I will end here. There's much more to talk about. I hope I've given you some ideas. Just to show you where you can get some more, there's some books, New Paradigm in Macroeconomics. There's my book, Principles of the Yen, quantumpublishers.com. You can get my reports at rwerner.substack, actually top right says that. Werner Economics, I'm going to post some more videos on that. I haven't done it recently. Thank you very much. Any questions?
I'm not sure if we got time for questions, Prof. But what I do want to say, that is probably the most humble statement you will hear over 2 days. When the professor said, that's me recommending quantitative easing in Japan, the man actually invented quantitative easing, the monetary policy tool to stimulate economic activity. Professor, honestly, we were at the LSE at the same time. We started in 1986 and we never met. Now we meet.
So 89 year. Which specialization were you?
International relations.
Oh, okay. IR.
Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Richard Werner. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is another very special speaker, Professor Ebrahim Moosa, if you'd like to come to the stage, from the University of Notre Dame. He'll be here. The professor will present Before the Chain Falls, Muslim Moral Transformation and the Decolonial Imagination. The argument is that genuine decolonization requires moral liberation of the self before the transformation of any political or epistemic structure. So, Professor Ebrahim Moosa, the stage is yours, sir. Welcome.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for this invitation. You've already got the title of my presentation, Before the Chain Falls, Muslim Moral Transformation and the decolonial imagination. There is a verse in the Quran that have been sitting with me for a very, very long time. It describes the Prophet Muhammad, his message, his purpose, what he came to do in the world. It does not say he came to build an empire. It does not say he came to win wars. It says he came to remove from people their burdens and the chains that were upon them. That is the verse, وَيَضَعُ عَنْهُمْ إِسْرَهُمْ وَالْأَغْلَالَ الَّتِي كَانَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ. But notice, chains, fetters, hold that image, chains falling. But notice they are not broken by external force. They are removed from a self that must first be ready to receive its own freedom. The emancipation of the soul must precede it and accompany it every step of the way. I want to talk about experience as method. I speak from a certain experience, not only from books and theories. As a political journalist in Cape Town during apartheid, and later at a conference of religious leaders in Soweto in 1988, I witnessed what Fanon warned, that decolonization is, quote, an agenda for total disorder. Violence mutates. Liberation can curdle. Years after democracy came to South Africa, my home was bombed when I exposed the bad faith of a vigilante group. The chaos of transition lingers long after freedom is declared. These experiences are not autobiography. They are method. And the central insight they taught me is this: a change of rulers without a change of souls is not liberation. It is a change of clothing. The soul is not yet free. A soul that is not yet free cannot free others. This is what the tradition knows. This is the decolonial imagination. The humanitarian order, that is the post-World War II order, and its betrayal of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission was epoch-making. And yet I argued in print that what it ultimately staged in South Africa was justice as performance, morally cathartic and structurally insufficient. Gestures of forgiveness were substituted for material, for restitution. Gestures of forgiveness were substituted for restitution. Victims were asked to perform their grief without the guarantee of material repair. Robert Meister, a great political theorist, gave me the language I had been reaching for. In After Evil, a very important book that he wrote, he demonstrates that the post-World War II humanitarian order works by converting moral outrage into depoliticized compassion, substituting sentiment for accountability. Never again for structural redress. Gaza is where this logic reaches its most devastating conclusion. Gaza becomes a diagnostic event that exposes whether our theology is real or performative. Meister's most chilling claim is this: Israel's survival functions as a, quote, constitutive exception of human rights discourse, such that Palestinian victimhood becomes structurally unthinkable within this moral economy. Muslim political theology has a direct response. Reconciliation without repair is theater. As the great Mamluk jurist Ibn Taymiyyah stated, quote, God will aid a just people even if it is an unbelieving one, and he will not aid an unjust people even if it is a believing one. One has to consider the soul before the struggle. This is the Ghazalian contribution of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who died in 1111, where he argues that that Muslim political, and Ghazali makes an original point in Muslim political theology, where he argues that it becomes indispensable, not as a medieval curiosity, but as a living resource, that one must work on the self. That the self and the healing of the self and the making of the self is absolutely vital. Drawing on Ghazali's Mizanul Amal, a very important book called The Weigh Scale of Deeds, I argue that Ghazali envisions the self as construed by what it does. Identity is not given. It is made through the discipline of practice. What you are doing, that is the vital thing. The body is not a passive vessel. The soul only becomes enlivened through knowledge and action. Nowadays, we don't like to talk about the soul. We keep on talking about the self. But the soul is the self. Ghazali describes flourishing, sa'ada, as the true purpose of life. Not happiness in the sense that you want to take some beverages or things that make you happy, but the very idea of flourishing in the best way. And the enemy of flourishing is futur, apathy, the acidia of the soul that refuses to move. The self that does not strive to cultivate itself is already in a process of deformation. The heart, the qalb, is simultaneously a physical organ and a metaphysical location where three capacities coalesce: the capacity to perceive, the capacity to know, and the capacity to experience. It is the heart that must be governed and aligned before justice can radiate outward into the world like sunlight. As Ghazali states in Refined Gold, reason belongs to the army of God. Unrestrained desire belongs to the army of Satan. When one is taken captive by the other, justice becomes impossible. We've all heard of the expression, just as you are, so shall you be governed. كَمَا تَكُونُ يُوَلَّ عَلَيْكُمْ. Sovereignty is co-produced from below as the crystallization of an inward moral life. Ghazali's most revolutionary concept is what is called fiqh an-nafs, the understanding and the discernment of the self. He takes the term fiqh, which is Islamic law's most technical term, and he internalizes it. True fiqh is not merely knowledge of rules, but he argues it is the cognition of the subtle perils afflicting the soul. So what is fiqh? Is the ability to understand and know those subtle perils, those dangers to the soul. The jurist of the self is the highest form of Muslim intellectual life. And this jurisprudence of the interior, the jurisprudence, the law of the interior life of the heart, is the precondition of just governance in the public sphere. The soul that is not yet free cannot free others. Ghazali knew this. The tradition knew this long before the language of decolonization existed. Ihsan, haqq, adl. Three concepts, all of this together. Ihsan is beauty as ethical practice. Adl, and when the Quran talks about ihsan, it says, repel evil with that which is more beautiful, and then the one with whom you had enmity will become a devoted friend. This is the highest form of ihsan, that you have the ability to repel evil with something that is more beautiful. To respond to ugliness with beauty is not passivity. It is a claim about the moral architecture of the encounter. You refuse to let the aggressor set the terms. This is precisely why tazkiyah, the purification of the soul, makes possible things in your heart. Haqq, truth, as both reality and right. Tradition understood as a living rope, not as a frozen monument. No single thread runs from the origin to the present. That the rope metaphor, which is a tradition of a rope, the rope, every generation builds something to the rope. That is what we call a tradition. Yet the rope holds because every generation weaves its own thread into it. Adl, justice as the grammar of history. Ghazali insists that sovereign silence before injustice is not neutrality, but complicity. Command responsibility ascends. It does not dissipate. So three things, ihsan, haqq, and adl. Not three ideas, one idea seen from three angles. Next topic I want to address is the issue of disagreement, ikhtilaf, and Muslim liberation theology. And I want to cite to you this poem by a very important Indian poet who says that my aspiration is so high, I do not fear the burning coals left by adversaries. But I do indeed tremble at the fire of the rose, dreading its blaze will torch the entire garden. What does this poem mean is that oftentimes that the destruction happens from within. He says, I do not fear the burning coals left by the adversaries, but it's the rose inside your garden, that rose can torch the entire garden. This is what has happened in most post-independent societies, that we get torched from within and with a lot of help from without. The Islamic tradition's culture of productive disagreement, ikhtilaf, is itself a moral achievement before it is an intellectual one. It requires a self secure enough not to need uniformity, humble enough to recognize its own limits and of its own formation. Ghazali insisted on ijtihad over taqleed, independent judgment over blind following, not only in the law, but in the formation of the soul itself. This connects directly to Muslim liberation theology, articulated by colleagues such as Farid Ishaq within South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle, by my friend Sherman Jackson in the face of black suffering in America, by Ali Shariati in his rereading of Karbala as a refusal to submit to any sovereignty that is not divine in pre-revolutionary Iran. What unites these three voices, Ishaq, Jackson, and Shariati, is this, that faith must manifest in history as resistance to injustice. And such resistance requires, as its interior architecture, a morally formed self. The soul that is not yet free cannot free others. Before the chain falls, first this, always first this. In the autumn, and that is the question, is you must let the chains fall. That must come first. You need to free yourself. In the autumn of my own life, in my own years, my hope is that the future will be more than just words and ink that I'm stating. That we leave behind a few traces of a good answer for those who come after. A scholar's faithful, if limited, attempt to reckon with the kaleidoscopic nature of knowledge and the soul's mysterious place within it. What would it take to pursue a liberation beautiful enough to attract, truthful enough to illuminate, and just enough to repair? Ihsan, haq, and adl. Not three answers, one answer. Waiting in the tradition, in the rope that every generation weaves itself into for a very long time. Before the chain falls, the soul must first be free. I thank you.
Undoubtedly the most metaphysical that we have heard, and how it relates to the real world. Thank you so much. Really, really thought-provoking. Professor Moosa, thank you so much indeed. I'd like to welcome to the stage Professor Fatoumata Hane from Hassan Sek University of Ziguinchor in Senegal. The professor will present. Please, Professor, come. The title of the professor's presentation is The Imperative Need to Decolonize Public Health in West Africa. So you're examining here the dependence on external funding and the marginalization of local therapeutic knowledge because of the colonial mindset. So, Professor, after you.
Thank you, Adnan. Je vais parler en français. Je suis désolée de vous décevoir. Je vais parler tout doucement pour permettre aux traducteurs de pouvoir faire passer le message. Je le fais en français parce qu'il est important que l'on puisse comprendre la profondeur de ce qui se joue derrière les problématiques de santé. On est en 2024. L'Afrique subsaharienne compte 11% de la population mondiale. Elle supporte 24% de la charge de morbidité mondiale et représente moins de 1% des dépenses publiques de santé. Vous comprendrez donc le poids des maladies, de la santé sur les finances, mais les enjeux que cela pose. Pourtant, on parle de santé mondiale. En quoi le concept de santé mondiale est important quand on parle de, ou qu'on essaye de comprendre la décolonisation? Ce concept voudrait décloisonner les frontières pour s'intéresser aux problématiques de santé, notamment aux injustices aux injustices épistémiques et politiques, qui concernent bien évidemment les populations à l'échelle du monde entier. Sans discrimination, donc. On pense que la réflexion sur la santé mondiale ne voyage pas. Et pourtant, les travaux historiques en épidémiologie, mais également dans les instituts Pasteur, ont montré l'ancrage colonial de l'impérialisme de la santé mondiale et les interventions de la santé publique en France, de la France en Afrique pendant la colonisation, démontrent qu'au-delà du discours humaniste, parce que derrière la colonisation, on a parlé d'humanisme, mais derrière le discours humaniste, le racisme et les discriminations dont ont fait preuve les responsables étaient bien là et continuent à être là. La France a même été un frein à la création de l'Organisation mondiale de la santé par peur que ses experts ne découvrent l'impact de la colonisation en Afrique. Et très récemment, dans le domaine de la santé, on constate encore l'existence de différenciations racialisées dans le cadre de travaux d'équipe et dans l'appréhension des sociétés dites africaines. Vous comprendrez donc que j'essaye de montrer combien le besoin d'évoquer la question de la décolonisation de la santé mondiale est urgente. La conscience de l'ampleur de la nécessaire décolonisation aujourd'hui évoquée dans toutes les conférences reste faible. Rares sont les personnes qui l'évoquent publiquement. On donne l'impression qu'il s'agit d'un secret public de santé publique, connu de tous, mais caché. Tout le monde est au courant, mais personne n'en parle. Et les personnes qui semblent vouloir prendre leurs responsabilités et agir sont combattues par les tenants de cette décolonisation de la santé et on va voir comment elle perdure. Je vais prendre deux exemples. Le premier exemple pour montrer ces permanences, c'est d'abord l'épidémie à coronavirus, cette pandémie qui a touché le monde entier. Et l'autre exemple que je vais prendre, les dernières élections présidentielles. Vous me demanderez qu'est-ce que Donald Trump vient faire dans tout ça, mais vous le comprendrez. Alors, en ce qui concerne l'épidémie à coronavirus, la pandémie, elle fut évidemment sanitaire. On a parlé de problèmes de santé. Mais elle fut aussi une prise de parole qui opposa les représentations de l'Afrique à d'autres conceptions de soi. La santé dit toujours plus qu'elle-même et ces controverses furent l'occasion pour certains d'exprimer diverses formes de ressentiment sociopolitique et très globalement de refuser une sorte de déni de considération ou au sein de ce que nous avons appelé, je dis nous, avec des collègues, on a fait un papier où on a parlé de la géopolitique de l'émotion. On a joué à se faire peur, on a essayé de nous faire peur. Maladie de tous, cette pandémie a construit et exacerbé un espace comparatif mondialisé des politiques publiques engagées face à l'épidémie. Le Covid fut un moment de tension, oui, mais les tensions n'étaient pas que sanitaires, elles étaient également politiques. Les visions péjoratives et humanitaires ont en commun de faire des États et des populations africaines des objets et des cibles de l'aide plutôt que les acteurs de leur propre histoire. Et cette forme de dépossession de soi fut inacceptable. Inacceptable pour les Africains. Et justement, un collectif de chercheurs écrit, je les cite, « Les raisons d'avoir sonné l'alarme se heurtent à des représentations de l'Afrique, de sa place dans le monde, entre l'habitus du catastrophisme et la paresse intellectuelle qui veut voir et trouver l'Afrique à la place du mort. Comme si, dans les représentations du monde, l'Afrique était confinée dans le rôle du berceau de la mort et les maux dont on ne guérit pas sans intervention extérieure et humanitaire. On a pensé que sans l'aide extérieure, on ne se sortirait pas du coronavirus, j'y reviendrai. Et donc, il s'est construit comme ça, dans ce contexte, un refus d'une Afrique comme terrain de recherche expérimentale, comme ça a pu l'être des années auparavant. Je vais citer également ces propositions d'études qui avaient été faites par des scientifiques qui, maladroitement ou péjorativement, lors d'un journal télévisé, un 3 avril 2020 ou 2021, ils ont dit, je cite, « Si je peux être provocateur, est-ce qu'on ne devrait pas faire cette étude en Afrique où il n'y a pas de masque, pas de traitement, pas de réanimation, un peu comme c'est fait d'ailleurs avec certaines études avec le sida ou chez les prostituées, on essaye des choses parce qu'on sait qu'elles sont hautement exposées. » Fin de citation. Les réponses à ces propos furent évidemment non médicales. Elles furent également politiques, évoquant des provocations coloniales et les corps noirs et pauvres, devenus des terrains d'expérimentation pour sauver des corps blancs et riches. Elles obligèrent l'Institut de recherche, l'INSERM, à présenter ses excuses à l'Afrique et le ministère français des Affaires étrangères à se désolidariser de ces propos qui entraînèrent une lourde condamnation de l'Organisation mondiale de la santé, qui, par la voix de son directeur, dira « L'héritage de la mentalité coloniale doit prendre fin. Il est honteux et horrifiant d'entendre des scientifiques tenir ce genre de propos au XXIe siècle. » Nous les condamnons dans les termes les plus forts. La blessure fut vive d'une compassion abusive et lourde, et fort lourde d'un manque de respect. Et pourtant, l'Afrique fit face. Les prédictions les plus sombres ne se réalisèrent pas. Et tout ceci est passé par des choix thérapeutiques autonomes. Il était important que les stratégies de prise en charge du coronavirus ne s'appuient pas sur des interventions extérieures. Mais quand vint le temps des vaccins, leur découverte a intensifié des stratégies nationales d'approvisionnement au détriment d'une vision globale qui intégrerait ainsi les pays du Sud. Au regard des appels lancés par certains chefs d'État, Mohamed Buhari du Nigeria ou Cyril Ramaphosa de l'Afrique du Sud, sur la nécessité d'une coopération mondiale, on peut douter que ces appels aient été entendus et que l'action de l'Organisation mondiale de la santé ait eu des suites conséquentes à la mesure des attentes placées dans un monde plus solidaire face à la Covid-19. Vœu pieux. Ainsi, les clivages politiques qui divisent le monde se sont maintenus. La pandémie a été un champ d'expression des rivalités entre les États-Unis et la Chine, entre les États-Unis et la Russie ou entre les États-Unis et l'Europe. Les puissances secondaires n'ont pas changé de positionnement. Chaque puissance a travaillé de son côté pour gérer les conséquences de la pandémie et pour trouver un vaccin pour son peuple, comme s'il s'agissait d'une endémie. Ces pays ont déployé des stratégies d'immunisation nationale face à une pandémie d'envergure planétaire. Cette situation rappelle la vacuité des principes d'une gouvernance sanitaire mondiale et d'une démocratie en santé. Ces mots, ces concepts sonnent creux. Et c'est là où, après cet épisode du coronavirus, qu'on se demande qu'est-ce que l'élection de Donald Trump vient faire là. On peut de manière naïve se poser la question de la relation entre ces élections et les amorces d'une crise sanitaire multiforme dans les Suds, mais pourtant, tout est lié. En effet, en signant le décret gelant les financements étrangers d'aide au développement actuel et futur, le 24 janvier 2024, et la dissolution de l'agence américaine, l'USAID, notamment intégrée au département d'État, le président américain a suscité sidération et peur, révélant, s'il en était besoin, les immenses défis aux politiques sanitaires des pays africains et du Sud global. La santé est le premier secteur d'intervention de l'USAID, qui est le principal partenaire technique et financier. Son rôle majeur dans la fabrique des politiques publiques dans le domaine de la santé n'est plus à démontrer. Depuis de nombreuses années, près d'une trentaine d'années, l'USAID travaille à la globalisation des politiques sanitaires et a conduit donc les États à adopter des principes qui leur sont fondamentalement étrangers. Mais ce que ça dit, c'est que les défis en santé aujourd'hui sont énormes pour les pays africains et dans les Suds. Le premier est la nécessité de trouver des financements de substitution pour les programmes dont dépendent des millions de vies. Et en court terme, l'enjeu est de poursuivre la gestion des programmes et des projets de santé. Mais cela ne peut se faire que par la mobilisation des financements domestiques des États pour assurer la santé de leur population, mais également la reconnaissance des savoirs endogènes et des savoirs locaux. Je vais terminer pour dire tout simplement que quand on parle de la santé, on pense à un concept qui est universel. Non, la santé n'est pas un concept neutre. La santé est géopolitique. Elle est le domaine par excellence où on peut appréhender les épistémicides. Oui, la santé mondiale est construite dans un système de pouvoir qui exclut les autres systèmes de soins et de savoir dont dépendent la vie de milliers de personnes. La santé n'est pas globale, elle n'est pas universelle. Elle consacre l'hégémonie d'un type de savoir dit scientifique qui construit ses propres règles de validation. Par conséquent, une rupture épistémique par rapport au racisme implique de construire un monde pluriversel. Vous allez me dire que je suis naïve. Et la prise en compte, mais tout ceci, la construction donc du monde pluriversel, passe par la prise en compte de toutes les perspectives, toutes les cosmologies et toutes les institutions à l'œuvre dans les pensées critiques des Suds et élaborées avec, depuis, des espaces et des corps subalternisés. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Professor, don't go anywhere. Sorry, I'm just waiting for the microphone because I want to say thank you so much. I hope that the translators, and I know they've been brilliant, and I'm sure they did, transmit the passion with which you spoke in French. Global power and how it affects the global health system. And we know already that USAID cuts are already leading to deaths in the developing world. Professor, merci beaucoup. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Merci.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, 3 brilliant speeches. Please come back, and we will be back at 15:30 for a discussion panel about rethinking development models. So a really, really important issue to discuss, if you're interested in it, of course, which I presume you are. Thank you so much. Enjoy the break.